The city had never been the same since the first body was found under the bridge. It was a cold, dreary night when a homeless man was discovered lifeless by a passerby. The police arrived on the scene, but they couldn't gather any leads. The city's security camera footage had mysteriously vanished, and there was no DNA evidence or indication of the cause of death. The autopsy report only deepened the mystery, revealing that the man's heart had ruptured. Weeks passed with no progress on the case. Then, another body was found under the same bridge. This time, the victim was a well-known entrepreneur in the area. The autopsy report, chillingly similar to the first, revealed that his heart had also ruptured. Detectives, now certain that the murders were connected, scrambled to find any shred of evidence that could lead them to the killer. They checked the security camera footage again, hoping to find some clue. They saw the entrepreneur walking into his office earlier in the day, but he never came out. The investigation hit another dead end. Soon, a third body was found beneath the bridge. Again, the detectives had no leads. The autopsy, however, uncovered something new. A single blonde hair was found wedged into a cut on the man's body. The victim had brown hair, so this discovery stood out. DNA testing led the investigators to a 23-year-old autistic man named Austin. They paid him a visit, hoping for answers. Austin's home was a small, modest house on the outskirts of town. His mother, a woman in her 70s, answered the door. Inside, they found Austin in a wheelchair, unable to walk or communicate. He was severely autistic, and his medical records confirmed his condition. The detectives left the house feeling defeated, unable to comprehend how someone like Austin could be involved in these brutal murders. Despite their doubts, the police kept a close eye on Austin's home. Yet, the murders continued. The next victim was discovered under the bridge, and this time, it was Austin himself. The killer had left another clue: a single hair wedged into a cut on Austin's body. The detectives, horrified by the discovery, tested the hair and found that it belonged to one of their own. The following day, the detective was found dead under the bridge, just like the others. The city was paralyzed with fear. The killer, now dubbed the Midnight Killer by the media, seemed to strike at random. All the victims had one thing in common: they were killed around midnight. The detectives were desperate to find the killer and put an end to this nightmare. One night, Detective Johnson, who had taken over the case, received an anonymous tip. The caller claimed that they had information about the Midnight Killer, but refused to give their name. The detective, grasping at straws, agreed to meet the informant at an abandoned warehouse. As Detective Johnson waited in the darkness, the informant's voice echoed through the empty warehouse. "You're getting closer to finding the Midnight Killer," the mysterious voice said. "But you must pay attention to the clues. The killer is taunting you, leaving you breadcrumbs to follow." Detective Johnson replied cautiously. "What do you mean? What breadcrumbs?" "The hair," the informant responded cryptically. "The hair is the key. Each victim's hair is found on the next victim's body. It's a chain, detective, and it won't stop until you break it." The detective was confused but intrigued. "What are you suggesting? That the killer is choosing the next victim based on the hair left behind?" "Exactly," the informant replied. "The Midnight Killer chooses their next victim based on the hair left behind, creating a deadly chain of victims. The killer is always one step ahead, selecting the next target before they've even finished with the current one. The only way to stop this cycle is to find the next victim before midnight and protect them from the killer's grasp." Detective Johnson's mind raced as he processed the information. "If what you're saying is true, we need to act fast. My colleague was the last victim. Who's next?" The informant hesitated before whispering, "You, Detective Johnson. The hair found on your colleague belonged to you. You're the next link in the chain." Chills ran down Detective Johnson's spine. He knew he had to act quickly, not only to save himself but to stop the Midnight Killer once and for all. He returned to the police station and shared the information with his fellow officers. They agreed to keep him under constant surveillance, and a team of detectives worked around the clock to find any new leads on the killer. As midnight approached, the tension in the station was palpable. Detective Johnson sat in his office, surrounded by fellow officers, waiting for the inevitable. The clock struck midnight, but nothing happened. The minutes ticked by, and still, everything was quiet. Suddenly, they heard a commotion from the holding cells. Rushing down the corridor, they found an officer slumped against the wall, unconscious. Inside the cell, the Midnight Killer was attempting to strangle another detective, who had been placed there for his protection. Detective Johnson and his colleagues burst into the cell, overpowering the assailant and pulling him away from their fellow officer. The Midnight Killer was finally captured, and his reign of terror came to an end. The chain of victims had been broken. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief, knowing that the nightmare was over. In the aftermath, the police discovered that the killer was a brilliant but deeply disturbed individual. He had been obsessed with the idea of creating an unbreakable chain of victims, always staying one step ahead of the police. The murders were never about the victims themselves, but about the thrill of the chase and the satisfaction of eluding capture. Though the Midnight Killer was now behind bars, the city would never forget the horror that had gripped its streets. And Detective Johnson would always remember the day he came face to face with the darkness and managed to break the lethal chain of the Midnight Killer. When you subscribe, be sure to click the notification bell. Click here for more true scary stories.